Dorothy Mae Calloway had made Harold's coffee every morning for 49 years. Not because he had asked her to, not because they had ever discussed it or agreed upon it, but because she woke earlier and the coffee was done when he came downstairs, and this was one of the thousand small arrangements that make up a long marriage, the kind that accumulate over decades without anyone deciding on them. The way a path gets worn in a yard not because someone laid it, but because two people kept walking the same way. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. Harold took his coffee black and drank it standing at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard while the world assembled itself around him. He never turned on the radio in the morning. He never read the paper until after breakfast. He had told her once, early in their marriage when she had asked about it, that mornings were for deciding what kind of day you were going to have before anything from the outside world could complicate the deciding. She had thought this was a very Harold thing to say. She had thought a great many things over 49 years were very Harold things. He had been dead for 8 months and 11 days when Dorothy finally opened his desk drawer. Not because she had been afraid of what was inside. She had known Harold Calloway for nearly 50 years, and she knew what he kept in that drawer the way you know which floorboard creaks and which eye on the stove runs hot. A checkbook. A flashlight with batteries that had been weak since 2019. A tin of cherry cough drops he had not touched in 3 years. A warranty card for a microwave they had replaced in 2011. She had not opened it because opening it required sitting in Harold's chair, and sitting in his chair meant pressing her own hands against the surface of the desk he had pressed his hands against every evening for 30 years, and she had not been able to make that transfer of weight until the morning of November 4th when the electric bill arrived, and she sat at the kitchen table and understood that she needed a number she did not have. The household finances were not right. She had known this in the way you know something you have been choosing not to look at directly. Harold had managed their money for 49 years with the same methodical care he brought to the maintenance of the car and the upkeep of the house. The accounts were in order. She had the checking and the savings and a certificate of deposit that matured in April. She had her Social Security and the small pension from the school district where she had worked as an administrative assistant for 22 years. Together, these were enough. They had always been enough because Harold had managed them in a way that made them enough, the way a good engineer manages a load-bearing system, not by what is impressive, but by what holds. Without Harold managing them, something was running differently. She had noticed without fully registering it for several months, the way a sound becomes background before you realize you have stopped hearing it. On the morning of November 4th, she sat down with the checkbook and the bank statements and went through them line by line. She found it on the 3rd page. A monthly withdrawal of $338, leaving the account on the 14th of every month, going to an entity listed in the bank records as Calloway Land Trust. She knew the name Calloway. She did not know the rest of it. She went to Harold's desk. She sat in his chair, which was easier than she had expected because she was focused on the task and not on the chair around her. She opened the drawer. The checkbook was there, the flashlight, the tin of cough drops. And underneath the checkbook, flat against the bottom of the drawer in a way that said it had been placed there deliberately, not just left, was a manila envelope. Not sealed at the top, just folded closed. Her name was on the front in Harold's handwriting, small and slanted and very precise. The handwriting of a man who had spent 31 years of his professional life drawing measurements on engineering blueprints with a fine mechanical pencil, each number standing exactly upright. She took the envelope to the kitchen. She made coffee first. Harold had said many times that she thought more clearly after coffee, and 49 years of mornings supported this. She drank half the cup standing at the window looking out at the backyard, looking at the bird feeder that had been empty since March. Harold had filled it every Sunday morning. She had watched him do it from this same window for 34 years and had never once filled it herself, which she had been thinking about since April without having done anything about it yet. Then she sat down and opened the envelope. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a property deed, 2 pages on legal paper. The property was in Harlan County, Kentucky, 212 acres, purchased in 1978 from an entity called Whitmore Civil Properties, LLC. The purchase price was $4,800. She noted this because in 1978, $4,800 had not been a small amount. She had been 7 months pregnant with Gerald in 1978. They had been careful with money the way young families with one income and a child coming are careful, and she had not noticed $4,800 leaving, and she now understood that Harold had chosen the timing with this in mind. At the bottom of the second page of the deed, in the margin, Harold had written a single sentence in pencil. "Do not sell this, Dottie. I mean it." The second document was a hand-drawn map on a sheet of graph paper from the block Harold kept in his office, the fine green grid faded to barely visible. The map showed a county road and a gravel drive with approximate distances marked at intervals. At the end of the drive was a rectangle labeled Calloway land. Inside the rectangle, near the center, was a smaller square. A single word was written inside it. Bunker. She read both documents twice. She put them on the table in front of her and looked at them. She looked at the empty bird feeder through the window. She looked at her own hands on the table, at the wedding ring loose on her finger now, because she had lost weight since March in the way that hunger stops working properly when the person you have eaten with for 49 years is no longer there to eat with. Harold had bought 212 acres in eastern Kentucky in 1978 and had not told her. He had been paying taxes on it for 46 years from a trust she had not known existed. He had drawn a map to it on graph paper. He had written her name on an envelope and put it in his desk. She made more coffee. She took her phone to Harold's office and sat in his chair again and typed Whitmore Civil Properties in 1978 and Harlan County, Kentucky into the search window. She found a paragraph in a digitized county newspaper from 1977, a piece about the decommissioning of a regional civil defense facility outside Lynch. Built between 1964 and 1967 as part of a continuity of government program, the article said, Harden construction, underground component. The land had been sold to private buyers over the 2 years following the decommissioning. Harold had been 22 years old during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had been a junior at the University of Kentucky studying civil engineering. She had known this. She had known this and had never thought about it in the context of a sealed government bunker on 212 acres of eastern Kentucky land. She sat with Harold's chair around her and thought about the shape of a thing for a long time. Then she called Gerald. He came the next afternoon in the gray Volvo he had bought the previous spring. He came with Pamela, which Dorothy had expected. Pamela was 45 and wore her competence the way some people wear a good coat, for the warmth of it, but also for what wearing it communicated. She had views about Dorothy's house since the funeral. The kitchen that needed updating. The hallway that needed paint. The gutters Harold had meant to replace in October. She did not say these things unkindly. She said them in the careful, steady voice of a woman who believed she was being practical on someone else's behalf. And Dorothy had learned in 22 years of Sunday dinners to hear the genuine care under the voice and let the voice itself go past her. Gerald sat at the kitchen table with the deed and the map in front of him. He read them the way he read everything, thoroughly and without rushing. He had Harold's eyes. He had Harold's habit of going still when something required more thought than the first version of the thought. She was grateful for these things. She had been grateful for them since he was a boy. "Mom," he said finally, "I had no idea Dad owned land in Harlan County. I didn't either until yesterday morning." Pamela was holding the deed with her reading glasses on, at the slight arm's-length angle she used when she wanted to appear to be reading something carefully. Harlan County. That's deep in the coal fields. What would property out there even be worth now? It has been depressed out there for decades. I haven't had it valued. I'm just saying. She set the deed down and took her glasses off and folded them. A decommissioned government structure, 46 years of sitting empty, in a county with real economic struggles. The liabilities on something like that could actually exceed whatever you would get for the land. And if it has been sealed up all this time, there is no telling what the condition is inside. I didn't say anything about selling it. Gerald looked at her. He set the map down carefully. He said, in the voice he used when he was trying to be balanced about a conclusion he had already reached, "I don't want to be the one to say something negative here, Mom. But I need to be realistic with you. Dad bought this for under $5,000 in 1978. It is an old government Cold War structure in a remote county. I think we need to be careful about expecting too much." Dorothy looked at her son. She looked at the map on the table in front of him, at the straight, careful lines Harold had drawn in pencil on graph paper. She said, read the note in the margin. Gerald picked up the deed again. He found the bottom of the second page. He read it. Something moved in his jaw. Pamela leaned over. Gerald tilted the deed so she could see. Pamela's expression shifted in a way she controlled very quickly, but not quite quickly enough. Your father wrote that, Dorothy said, the last time he updated the deed, which the notary date tells me was about 3 years ago. Of course, said Pamela, and I understand why that feels meaningful. But sweetheart, these decisions, buying land in the middle of nowhere, writing warnings on deeds, they come from a place of emotion. Your father was a young man during the Cold War. He was scared. A lot of people built bomb shelters out of that kind of fear. It does not necessarily mean there is something of real financial value out there. Dorothy looked at Pamela for a moment. She did this sometimes, and Pamela had never learned to read the looking, which was not an unfriendly look, but was not a neutral one either. Harold was an engineer for 31 years, Dorothy said. He was not a man who maintained a financial commitment for 46 years out of unchecked emotion. He paid taxes on that land out of a trust that has been deducting from our account on the 14th of every month for as long as I can find records, and I did not notice it because I was not looking for it, which means he arranged it that way. He arranged a great many things. That way, she looked at Gerald. I am going to drive to Harlan County on Saturday by myself. I would like you both to know that. Gerald started to respond, and she raised one hand, the particular hand gesture that had been communicating the end of a discussion since he was 12, and he stopped. You can come the second time, she said. I need to go alone the first time. After they left, she made herself a simple supper she did not finish and sat at Harold's desk again until the house went dark around her. She read the deed a third time. She read the notation at the bottom of the second page again. She found, on the third careful reading, a supplementary clause Harold had typed rather than handwritten in a section at the back labeled additional terms. It said, the combination to the entry is 1953. In case you are wondering why that number, Dottie, it is the year I was born. Because I knew you would figure that out even without me there to tell you. She read those 2 sentences 4 times. She did not know whether to laugh or to put her head down on the desk and stay there. She did the first, quietly, to herself in the empty office, and then she went to bed and lay on Harold's side of the mattress because she had been sleeping there since March without meaning to, as if the body remembered where the warmth had been and kept returning to the place it was no longer. She left before 5 in the morning on Saturday. The Buick ran well. Harold had changed the oil in it 2 months before he died, and she had changed it herself in October for the first time. Watching a video on the computer twice beforehand, and using latex gloves she found under the kitchen sink. She had not told Gerald about this because he would have offered to take the car to a garage, and she had not wanted the garage. She had wanted to do it herself. She had done it herself. The check engine light was off. This was, she had decided, the last entirely uncomplicated gift Harold had left her before the desk drawer, a car that ran. She drove south in the early dark and then east as the sky turned from black to gray to the flat white of a November overcast. The interstate gave way to state routes, and the state routes narrowed into county roads that wound up into the eastern mountains in slow switchbacks. The land changed as she climbed. The hardwoods stood bare on the ridges. A creek ran alongside the road for a long stretch, clear cold water over dark stone. A white clapboard church with a hand-lettered sign on the reader board. A gas station closed for the season with plywood on the windows. A farmhouse set back from the road with smoke from the chimney and a dog in the yard who watched her pass with the patient assessment of an animal who has seen a great many strangers go by and has long since stopped finding them remarkable. She stopped at a small diner outside Harlan for coffee. The place was nearly empty in the mid-morning hour. A man in his 60s with a white beard trimmed close to his jaw looked up from behind the counter when she came in and then looked again, not rudely, in the way of a man who does not often see unfamiliar faces and catalogs the ones he does. She ordered coffee and showed him the map on her phone and asked about the county road she was looking for. He came around the counter and squinted at the screen. He said the road was another 11 miles east and then north, and that the gravel drive off it would be easy to miss because the locusts had grown back in at the entrance over the years. You know that drive? She asked. He looked at her. He said, there is only one property up that way that anyone has used in a long time. There was a fellow came through here pretty regularly over the years. Stocky, quiet man, dark hair gone gray. Drove an old blue pickup for a long time and then a different truck. He always sat at the far end of the counter. Never said much about what he was doing up there. That kind of man, you didn't ask. Harold had driven a blue Chevrolet pickup for 11 years, 1997 through 2008. Dorothy sat with her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the counter in front of her for a moment. She said, "I believe that was my husband." The man was quiet. He said, "I am sorry for your loss, ma'am. He came through here a long time." She thanked him. She finished the coffee. She drove the 11 miles and turned north and found the entrance to the gravel drive just where he had said, screened by locusts that had grown back enough to obscure it at highway speed. She pulled off and got out of the car with Harold's map in her hand. The gravel drive was old, but it had been supplemented over the years, new gravel packed over a solid base. The drainage ditches on either side clear of debris, the locust branches overhead trimmed back to a clearance wide enough for a truck to pass under. This was not a road that had been left entirely alone for 46 years. Someone had maintained it. Someone who understood what a maintained road required and had kept providing it, year after year, without being asked by anyone who knew about it. She drove the quarter mile. The clearing at the end was perhaps an acre. The grass was frost-burned and silver in the November light, mowed at some point in the past year, the stubble pattern still visible. At the far end of the clearing, set into the face of the hillside with the low, deliberate profile of a thing designed to be invisible from the air, was the bunker. She had not let herself form a picture of it during the drive, because pictures she formed in advance of seeing a thing were almost always wrong in some way that mattered. She saw it now. Poured concrete painted institutional gray, set into the hillside with a precision that told her who had designed the formwork and the pour and the placement. A heavy steel door in a structural steel frame, centered in the face of the building. 3 bolt locks running vertically down the right side of the frame. A combination dial set into the concrete too. The left of the door at chest height. The face of it numbered 0 through 99. The surface weathered but clean. The paint on the concrete had faded. The structure beneath the paint had not. She could see this from 40 feet away, the way you see that a well-built house is sound before you have set foot inside it. The way the foundation shows through the walls if you know how to look. She sat in the car with the engine off and the heater ticking as it cooled, and she looked at the path in the frost-burned grass between the end of the gravel drive and the bunker door. It was not a path that had been cut. No one had taken a spade to it or marked it deliberately. It was a path worn by feet returning to the same place the same way over years until the ground remembered the weight and held the shape of it. A path worn the way the path in her backyard between the kitchen door and the workshop had been worn by Harold over 34 years of evenings when he went out to finish something that needed finishing. Harold's path. Harold walking this 40 yards from where her car now sat to that door. How many times, over how many years, while she had been home believing he was at the hardware store in Lexington or the estate sale in Versailles, or somewhere else entirely, somewhere ordinary. She got out of the car. The cold was sharper than she had prepared for. She pulled her coat across her chest and walked the path. She turned the dial with both hands. Left to 1, right to 9, left to 5, right to 3. The mechanism was stiff in the cold, but it moved smoothly on its bearings, the way a well-made thing moves when it has been kept up. She stopped on 3. The first bolt handle turned. The second, the third. Harold had connected all 3 locks to a single mechanism. One combination, 1 key, 1 door. She put her full weight behind the handle. The door weighed what 300 pounds of engineered steel weighs when the hinges are built to carry it. But they were built to carry it, and they turned, and the door swung outward, and the air that came out to meet her was cool and dry and faintly metallic, and underneath the metal was the smell she recognized from Harold's workshop at the end of their backyard in Louisville. Linseed oil. Cedar shavings. The particular smell of a space where a careful man had worked with his hands many times over many years. She stood in the open doorway. A corridor ran 15 feet to a second door. Fluorescent tubes along the ceiling were lit, powered by a utility line run to a junction box set into the wall inside the entrance. The floor was poured concrete, clean in the way a floor gets clean when no dirt is ever tracked across it. The walls were smooth concrete without gaps or cracks. A ventilation system somewhere deeper in the structure moved the air in a steady, even measure she could hear, but not yet see. She pushed through the second door. The room was 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a ceiling 12 feet high. A row of work lights ran along the right wall. Fluorescent tubes in the ceiling. All of it on. All of it steady. A climate control unit mounted in the upper right corner of the room showed a digital temperature reading and a humidity reading, both of them holding at numbers whose precise correctness she could not have told you, but that the absolute stillness of the displays suggested to her were exactly where Harold had determined they needed to be. She stood in the doorway and she looked at what Harold Calloway had been building for 40 years. Along the right wall, on metal shelving units bolted directly to the concrete with anchor bolts, were wooden cases. Each one sealed, each one labeled in Harold's handwriting with a number and a date. She walked to the shelving and read the numbers. The first case was labeled 1 and dated 1979. She walked the length of the row counting as she went, and the last case she could find at the far end of the shelving was numbered 117. The date on it was from the spring of the year Harold died. He had added to this room within the last year of his life. He had driven here within the last year of his life and placed one more case in the row that had been growing since the year his son was born. Against the far wall, hung on a wooden framework Harold had built from lumber and eye-hooks and horizontal rails at measured intervals, were paintings. Not photographs. Not reproductions. Paintings on canvas in their original frames, some ornate and some plain, covering the full width of the far wall from 3 feet above the floor to within a foot of the ceiling. She walked toward them and counted as she went. 14 paintings. The humidity gauge on the wall beside the framework held a needle that did not waver. She stopped in front of the paintings and looked at each one in turn. She did not recognize any of them in the way of knowing a title or an artist's name. She recognized something else. The quality that is present in a thing made by a hand that has spent a lifetime at a single kind of making, the quality that shows in a well-jointed cabinet and in a well-laid stone wall, and in the face of someone who has done one specific thing for many years with their full attention and nothing held back. She turned from the paintings. Along the center of the room, on wooden pallets arranged in rows with the even spacing of a man who had planned the layout before he began placing anything, were metal containers, each one sealed with a clasp and labeled in Harold's handwriting. And along the near wall, on low shelving close to the concrete floor, were objects she had noticed when she first entered the room and had been approaching the way you approach a thing you have a feeling about before the information to support the feeling has arrived. They were stacked in rows, 10 objects to a row, 4 rows to a shelf unit, 3 shelf units side by side. Each object was rectangular, roughly the dimensions of a very thick book, but far denser, far heavier. Looking, the surface was not iron and not steel. She knew steel. She had lived for 34 years with a man whose workshop held steel in several forms, and she knew what it looked like and what it did with light. What she was looking at did something different with the light, something warmer, something that belonged to a different category than any metal she handled in daily life. She had seen the quality once before, in a single specific context she was locating in her memory now. A natural history museum, 30 years ago, a display case with a placard underneath it, and her 7-year-old grandson beside her asking what it was. She walked to the nearest shelf. She bent down. She picked up one of the objects with both hands. The weight came before the recognition. It arrived in her wrists, and then in her forearms, and then somewhere higher up where understanding lives before the words for it have yet formed. She turned it over. On the flat underside was a stamp pressed into the surface with a die, a hallmark, and a same mark. A purity number she recognized from that museum placard 30 years ago, and from a document she had read late on Friday night in Harold's office, searching for anything that would help her understand what she was driving 4 hours to see. She set it down. She stood up. She put both hands on the shelving unit beside her and gave herself 30 seconds to breathe in the deliberate way she had been practicing since March, the way you practice a thing that does not come naturally when you have been used to not needing it. Then she took her hands off the shelf and she looked at the 3 shelf units along the near wall, and she counted the rows and stacks, and she did a number in her head, and then set the number aside, because she did not yet have enough information to complete it correctly. But the beginning of the number was there. The beginning of it was already large. She found the tool bucket Harold had left by the door. 3 of them, each one containing what a person would need to begin understanding the room they were standing in. A flat putty knife for the sealed case lids. A small flashlight. A notepad with a pen clipped to the cover. A folding ruler. A magnifying glass of the type used by estate sale buyers to read fine print and to identify the marks pressed into the backs of things. and inside a small envelope at the bottom of the bucket, a printed sheet of paper folded twice, which she opened and unfolded. It was a list in Harold's handwriting, numbered from 1 to 37. Each line described an item in the shorthand of a man who had spent decades reading auction house catalogs. Shorthand she could partially parse and partially could not. At the right margin of each line was a number written in pencil. A reference price. A price from an auction record for a comparable item. She read down the list. She stopped at line 9. She read the number at the right margin of line 9 twice. She set the list down on the nearest shelf and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The way Gerald looked at ceilings when a room has become too small for what is being thought in it. Then she picked the list back up and kept reading. She opened the camera on her phone. She moved through the room from the entrance to the far wall and back again. The way Harold had organized the space, methodical, nothing skipped. She took a photograph of each case label on the shelving. She took a photograph of each painting on the far wall, the whole canvas, and then a close-up of each lower corner where a signature might be pressed into the paint. She photographed the temperature display and the humidity gauge and the ventilation panel. She photographed the stacked objects on the low shelving from 3 angles. She photographed the list from the tool bucket and the tool bucket itself and the magnifying glass and the folding ruler and the notepad with the pen still clipped to the cover. She photographed the worn path on the concrete floor between the second door and the far wall, the path worn by Harold's feet over 10,000 crossings of this same floor. She took 63 photographs. Then she sat down on the concrete floor in the center of the room with her back against one of the pallets and her coat pulled around her and her phone in her lap, and she looked at everything Harold had built around her. She looked at case number 1 from 1979 and case number 117 from the spring of the year he died. She looked at the path his feet had worn into the floor and at the climate control unit he had installed so that whatever he was keeping here would be kept at exactly what it required. She looked at the 14 paintings on the far wall and the frames he had hung on the framework he had built with his own hands. She thought about Harold at 31 years old arriving here for the first time with the deed in his pocket and $4,800 drawn from their joint account in a month when she had been 7 months pregnant and not tracking the balance with her usual attention, and she understood that he had chosen the month for exactly that reason. She thought about him at 40 and at 50 and at 68. Making this drive on the Saturday she had believed he was at the hardware store in Lexington, coming home in the late afternoon smelling of the road and saying little about where he had been, and her not asking because she had trusted him with her whole self since the day she married him and had never had cause to do otherwise. She had given him 46 years of Saturdays without a question. He had used every one of them for this. She thought about the 48th anniversary dinner, the red check tablecloth at the restaurant they had been going to since 1989, the piano player who knew Harold's favorite song and always played it when they came in. Harold setting his fork down in the middle of the tiramisu and looking at her across the table and saying, "Dottie, I want you to know that you are going to be all right. Whatever happens, you are going to be all right. There are things in this world I have put away for you that you do not know about yet. And when the time comes, you will find them." She had told him he was being morbid. She had told him to finish his dessert. He had finished it, and the piano player had played his song, and they had driven home in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have been telling each other what matters for so long that the silence between sentences carries it too. She picked up her phone. She called Gerald. He answered on the second ring. "I am inside," she said. "I have seen it. How is it? What is it like in there?" She looked at the shelving running from 1979 to the spring of the year Harold died. She looked at the 14 paintings and the climate control unit and the pallets of sealed containers. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. And the low shelving along the near wall. She looked at the path on the floor. Gerald, she said, your father spent 40 years building something for us. There was a pause on the line. A specific kind of pause. What do you mean? What is in there? I am going to send you 63 photographs, she said. I want you to look at all of them before you call me back. Not some of them. All 63. Start with the ones I took at the end, because those are the ones I need you to see first. His voice changed in the way she recognized from 30 years of phone calls. The change that meant he had become very still. Mom, are you serious right now? She looked at the list from the tool bucket lying on the shelf beside her. At the numbers Harold had written at the right margin of each line in his small, precise pencil. Yes, she said. I am serious. Look at the photographs. All 63. She sent them. She sat on the cold floor and waited. Outside the bunker the afternoon had moved well along. The flat white sky had lowered and the temperature had dropped another degree, and she would need to leave within the hour to be off the Mountain County Road before full dark. She did not move from the floor. She was thinking about a man who drove 8 hours round trip every few weeks for 40 years. She was thinking about what 40 years of drives like that added up to, and she was leaving the number as a number rather than converting it to days, because converting it to days produced something she was not yet ready to sit with in full on a concrete floor in a Kentucky hillside. She was thinking about the specific quality of Harold's silences when he came home from the direction he said was the hardware store. Not the silence of a man concealing something shameful. The silence of a man who was holding something he was not yet ready to give. The way you hold a gift you have made with your hands until the moment it is ready and the moment is right. The moment had been intended for their 50th anniversary. She understood this without being told. Harold had been planning to tell her on their 50th anniversary, which would have been in August. He died in March, for months before August. He had been 4 months from being able to tell her himself. She sat on the floor with this for a moment. She let herself sit with it. Gerald called back in 24 minutes. He said, very slowly, Mom. Those objects on the lower shelving. Are those what I think they are? I believe so, yes. He was quiet in a way that had weight. How many? She looked at the 3 shelf units along the near wall. She looked at the rows and the stacks. She looked at the room around her and all that Harold had placed in it since the year his son was born. I do not know the exact count yet, she said. Understanding what is here is going to take more than one visit. I am going to need help with this. The right kind of help. What kind? She thought about the list in the tool bucket and the reference prices at the right margin. She thought about 14 paintings on a climate-controlled wall. She thought about a magnifying glass Harold had left by the door because he knew she would need it and would not know to bring one. The kind that can tell me what these things are worth, she said. And that can be trusted not to say a word to anyone until they have told me first. Gerald said he would make calls the following week. She said thank you and hung up and stood and walked through the room one final time without the camera, just looking. She looked at the cases running from 1979 to the spring of the year Harold died. She looked at the paintings and the palettes and the rows of heavy objects on the low shelving, catching the light in that specific warm way. She looked at the path worn into the floor by Harold's feet over how many years and how many crossings. She pulled the inner door closed. She walked the corridor and stepped out into the clearing and shut the heavy outer door and worked the combination back, the bolts driving home with the solid sound of an engineered system returning to the position it was built to hold. She walked Harold's path in reverse, back across the frost-burned grass to the car. She stood beside the car with one hand on the door and looked back at the bunker entrance, at the combination dial, at the concrete set into the hillside. Then she got in and drove the quarter-mile back to the county road and turned south and began the 4 hours home. The mountains fell away in the rear view. The county roads widened into state routes. The flat November dark came down and the highway opened up and she drove in silence. No radio, the way Harold had always preferred to drive, 1 mile at a time in the headlights. She had packed a sandwich she had not eaten. She ate it somewhere outside London, Kentucky, with one hand on the wheel and the Buick doing 72 and the reflectors on the guardrail going past in the dark. She had not eaten much since March. She ate the whole sandwich. She thought about a man who had told her across a red check tablecloth on their 48th anniversary that she was going to be all right, who had said it in the particular way you say a thing you have already arranged, not hoped for, who had put down his fork and looked at her across 48 years of a shared life and said it plainly, and then picked up his fork and finished his dessert and gone home with her in the quiet dark without elaborating, because Harold Calloway had never needed to say a thing twice once he had said it clearly. She was going to need an appraiser. She was going to need an attorney. She was going to need Gerald, not because she could not carry this alone, but because Harold would have understood that the right structure under a thing was never a sign of weakness. He had understood that his whole life. He had built everything he ever built with the right structure underneath. She would understand the full size of what was in that room in time. She would open each of those 117 cases. She would learn each of those 14 paintings and what they were and who had made them and what Harold had paid for them at estate sales over 40 years and what they were worth today. She would weigh and count what was on the low shelving and learn the number the way you learn a number that is too large to hold all at once, one portion at a time, until the whole of it becomes a thing you can stand in front of without needing to look away. She would understand all of it. But not tonight. Tonight she drove home through the dark with the weight of an empty passenger seat beside her and something she could not yet name sitting in her chest, something that was not quite happiness and was not grief, something that was the particular feeling of a person who has been told the truth about someone they loved and has found that the truth is larger than they had known to ask for. The bird feeder was going to be full by Sunday morning. She had decided this somewhere around the county line, and she held it as a small fixed point in the dark all the way back to the house where Harold had pressed his hands against a desk for 30 years and drunk his coffee standing at the window and filled that feeder every Sunday morning of his life without ever once thinking it required mentioning. She would fill it on Sunday. She would stand at the window the way he had stood, and she would begin to understand what he had left her, one piece at a time, in the order he had always taught her things were best learned. Carefully, without rushing, with the full attention of a person who already knew the answer was going to be worth the time it took to get there. Gerald called on Wednesday. He had found someone, he said, a woman named Lyle who ran an appraisal practice in Louisville that handled estate work for auction houses, insurance companies, and private clients who needed a thorough accounting before they could begin deciding what to do. She had 26 years of experience. She held certifications in numismatics from 2 professional bodies and in fine art appraisal from a 3rd. Gerald had done his research because Gerald always did his research. He had spoken with her for 40 minutes on the phone, and she had asked precise questions and had not asked unnecessary ones, and at the end of the call, she said she could be available the following Saturday if Dorothy wanted to proceed that quickly. Dorothy said yes. She asked Gerald whether Pamela was coming. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I think this one should be just us, if you are all right with that. She said she was all right with that. They drove down together on Saturday, leaving Dorothy's house before 5 in the morning in Gerald's Volvo. Gerald drove because he had asked to and she had let him because there was something he needed to do with his hands on a 4-hour drive, and driving was as good as anything else. He had not said much since she had sent the 63 photographs. He had called back in 24 minutes, then called again twice that same evening, then come to the house on Tuesday and sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and looked at the photographs on her phone one more time without saying much of substance. She could see him doing what he had always done since he was a boy, assembling pieces in the right order before he was ready to speak them out loud. They drove south through the Louisville dark and then east as the light came up flat and gray. Gerald asked questions as they went, carefully and in sequence. He asked about the deed and the combination and the condition of the building. She answered what she could answer. When he asked about the list she had found in the tool bucket, she took it from her coat pocket and unfolded it and read him several of the line items with their reference prices, and he drove without saying anything for a long time after that. She watched the landscape change in the passenger window, and she let him have his silence because it was the working kind. Lyle was already parked at the entrance to the county road when they turned north off the state route. She had a white truck with a topper on the bed, and she got out when she saw them coming. A woman in her early 60s with silver hair cut close, and the kind of direct, unhurried manner that comes from 26 years of walking into strangers' estates and telling them the truth about what they had. She wore a canvas field coat with deep pockets and carried a hard-sided case in one hand and a camera bag over the other shoulder. She shook Dorothy's hand and then Gerald's hand, and she did not say anything about the distance or the weather or the morning or any of the things people say to fill the space before they have assessed a situation. She was already assessing the situation. She said, "You described wooden cases on shelving along one wall, paintings on the opposite wall, and objects on low shelving near the entrance. Is that the order you would like to work in?" Dorothy said, "Start where you think is best. You will know better than I do." They drove the quarter-mile to the clearing together, Catherine following in her truck. Gerald got out in the clearing and stood looking at the bunker with his hands in his coat pockets and his shoulders drawn up against the cold. He looked at the structure set into the hillside, at the concrete and the steel door and the combination dial, with the expression of a man who is revising something he believed to be true. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. He said, "Dad did this. I mean the locks and the ventilation, all of it. He set this up himself. He bought the property," Dorothy said. "The building was already here. He modified it over time." Gerald looked at the path worn into the frost-burned grass between the drive and the door. He said, "He made that path." Dorothy said yes. Gerald did not say anything else. He walked the path behind her to the door and watched her work the combination without hesitation. Left to 1, right to 9, left to 5, right to 3, and he watched the bolts release and the heavy door swing outward and the cool, dry air come out of the corridor. He stood in the doorway behind her and looked at the lit corridor and the second door at the end of it. He said, quietly, and to the air rather than to anyone, "What did he tell me he was doing on Saturdays?" "Hardware store mostly," Dorothy said. "Sometimes the estate sales." She pushed through the second door. Gerald followed her in. He stopped 2 steps past the threshold, and he did not move for a long time. He turned his head slowly from one end of the room to the other, taking in the shelving cases and the paintings on the far wall and the pallets in the center and the low shelving along the near wall. The work lights were on. The climate control held the room at whatever Harold had determined it needed to be held at, the display reading exactly what it had read the Saturday before. Catherine had come in behind them and was already moving toward the paintings with her camera out. She did not say anything. She had walked into a great many rooms over 26 years, and she had the particular self-containment of a person who understands that her job is to look at things, and that looking at things requires not talking while you do it. Gerald said, "Mom, there must be 100 cases on that shelving." 117, Dorothy said. He looked at the shelving. He looked at the numbers running from one end to the other. He said, 117. He had been adding to it since 1979, Dorothy said. The last one is dated from the spring of the year he died. Gerald turned to look at her. He was 48 years old, and she had known every expression on his face since he was born, and the one he was wearing now she had not seen before. It was the expression of a man who has understood something about his father that makes the whole architecture of his childhood look different from a new angle. He said, "He never said a word." She said, "No, he never said a word." From across the room, Catherine said, "Mrs. Calloway, could you come and look at this one with me for a moment?" She had stopped in front of the third painting from the left end of the wall. Dorothy and Gerald crossed the room to stand beside her. Catherine was holding her phone up to the lower right corner of the canvas, the light from it illuminating the edge of the paint where a signature might be pressed into the dry surface. She said, "Do you know where your husband acquired this piece?" Dorothy said she did not know the specific origin. "Estate sales," she said. "He went to estate sales in Kentucky and the surrounding states for about 40 years. He rarely said much about what he had brought home." Catherine looked at the canvas for a long time. She brought out her magnifying loupe and pressed it to her eye and looked at the surface and then at the back of the frame, tilting it very carefully from the wall. She set it back against the framework and she looked at Dorothy. She said, "This is a George Caleb Bingham." She let that sit for a moment. He is considered the primary painter of American frontier and river life in the 19th century. His work is in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. It is in the Metropolitan. It is in the Nelson-Atkins in Kansas City. The last comparable painting by Bingham to come to public auction sold at Christie's in New York for $14.3 million. She paused. "This one is in considerably better condition than that one." The room was quiet. Gerald made a sound. It was not a word. Dorothy looked at the painting. It was a river scene. Flatboatmen on a wide Missouri River with the light coming from the left the way Bingham's light always came. That quality of the actual American light of the actual American middle of the 19th century that was present in only a small number of surviving canvases and could not be replicated and could not be faked in a way that held up to exactly this kind of examination. How did he know? Gerald said. How did Dad know what this was? Dorothy thought about Harold at estate sales for 40 years. Harold with the magnifying glass now sitting in the tool bucket by the door, crouching at the low shelves of estate sale tables, looking at things other people had looked at and walked past. Harold, who had told her once that the difference between something worth keeping and something worth leaving was almost never announced, and that the people who could tell the difference were almost never the people who already had the most. She said, he had 40 years to learn. Catherine moved to the next painting, then the next. She photographed each one from the front and from the back. She spent the longest time, 23 minutes by Dorothy's watch, in front of the 7th painting from the left. She said nothing during those 23 minutes. She circled the painting twice with the loupe. She photographed the canvas from 4 angles. She looked at the stretcher bars through the back. She stepped away 10 feet and then walked back up to it. She turned to Dorothy. She said, "This is a Martin Johnson heat. He was a luminist painter, 19th century, known primarily for his hummingbirds and orchid compositions and his coastal light paintings. His work is held by every major American museum and has been actively collected for 3 decades. The last heat to reach public auction sold for $22 million. She looked at the painting. I would want a specialist's formal opinion before I put a figure on this one. But in my professional judgment, this is genuine and the condition is extraordinary. The condition alone puts it at the upper range of what this market has seen for his work." Gerald sat down on the concrete floor. He lowered himself deliberately. The way a man sits down when he has decided the floor is the most honest place to be. He sat there with his coat on and looked at the painting his father had bought at an estate sale somewhere in Kentucky or Tennessee or Ohio for a price that would not have raised an eyebrow, and that was now worth, at minimum, something on the far side of $20 million. Dorothy let him sit. She had things she needed to understand. Catherine worked through the remaining 12 paintings. She photographed each one and made notes in her leather book. Of the 14, she could give a preliminary figure on 4 with reasonable confidence. On 3 more she said she believed she knew the attribution but would need to consult with colleagues. The remaining 7 she described as requiring formal analysis, though her read of the style and period and condition suggested they were not minor works. She turned from the paintings and said, "I would like to look at the cases now." Dorothy brought her the putty knife from the tool bucket. Catherine opened the first case carefully, working the sealed edge without forcing it. Inside, packed in acid-free tissue, were graded coins in their sealed holders. She lifted one and looked at it through the loupe and read the grading label and set it down. She lifted another. Another. She said, "These are professionally graded coins, certified by NGC and PCGS, which are the 2 leading numismatic grading services in the country. Your husband did not simply buy coins. He bought coins that had already been formally assessed and recorded. That is a specific kind of work. You do not accumulate a case of certified rare coins by going to estate sales and buying whatever is there. You do it by knowing what you are looking for and by finding it over a very long time." Gerald, from the floor, said, "What does the certification mean for the value?" Catherine said, "Certified coins sell for substantially more than uncertified coins of the same type, because the buyer has the formal professional opinion attached to the piece. Your father was building a collection that came pre-authenticated. He was doing on the front end what buyers and estates normally have to pay to have done after the fact. He did it across 40 years, which is how you build the most defensible collection of this type." She opened case 2. More certified coins, different denominations. She opened case 10, near the middle of the lower shelf. Case 40, case 60, case 90. She did not open every case. She sampled across the full range of dates, and she took notes and photographed the contents of each case she opened. At case 31 she stopped. She looked at the contents for a long time. She lifted a single coin in its holder and read the grading label twice. She turned the holder over and read the reverse side. She held it to the work light. She said, "Mrs. Calloway, this is a 1933 double eagle." Dorothy said she did not know what that was. Catherine set the coin holder down in the tissue. She said, "The 1933 Saint-Gaudens double eagle is the most legally complicated and the most widely known coin in American collecting history. In 1933, the United States government ordered all existing gold coinage to be surrendered and melted down as part of the move off the gold standard. A small number of 1933 double eagles had left the mint before the recall order reached the facility. The government subsequently declared all surviving examples to be illegal to own and spent decades attempting to recover them through seizure. Over the following 70 years, fewer than 20 specimens were confirmed to have survived in private hands. In 2002, the only example the government formally permitted to remain in private ownership sold at auction for $7.6 million. In 2021, another confirmed specimen sold for $18.8 million. She looked at the coin in the tissue. "The certification on this holder is genuine," she said. "The grade is MS-65, which is exceptional preservation. I do not know how your husband acquired this specific example. It is possible he acquired it during a period before the legal questions around these coins were fully adjudicated, which occurred in stages across several decades. It is also possible there is documentation in the other cases or the containers that speaks to the provenance. We will need a specialist in numismatic law to address the legal status before this coin can be formally valued or transferred. But I want you to understand clearly what you are looking at." She looked up from the coin to Dorothy. "You are looking at something that belongs in a category by itself." The room was very quiet. Gerald got up off the floor. He had been on the floor for 40 minutes, and he got up now because whatever had been decided by the floor had been decided. He walked to the shelving, and he stood beside his mother, and he looked at the coin in the tissue inside the open case. He said, "Dad found this at an estate sale." Dorothy said, "That is what I believe." He said, "Someone had it in a box somewhere in Kentucky, and Dad was the one who looked at it and knew what it was." She said, "Someone had it somewhere, and your father was the one looking." Gerald pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. He held them there for a moment. Then he lowered his hand and turned to Catherine and said, "Tell me what you need from the remaining cases." Catherine told him. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, Gerald and Catherine moving along the shelving, Dorothy sitting at the tool bucket with the notepad Harold had left there, recording what Catherine said. The coin cases varied in type, but not in care. Pre-1933 American gold, Morgan silver dollars, early American copper, some foreign gold pieces that Catherine identified as French and British and Swiss coins Harold had bought from estate dispersals of old Kentucky families whose ancestors had held hard assets across the Depression and kept them in drawers and cedar chests for 80 years after the need for them had passed. Each case had been packed in the same way. Acid-free tissue, certified holders for the graded pieces, and inside each case a small index card in Harold's handwriting listing the contents, the dates of acquisition, and what he had paid. Catherine paused at case 67. She held up one of the index cards. She showed it to Dorothy without speaking. The card was dated 1991. It listed 6 Morgan silver dollars. The acquisition prices ran from $180 to $420 per coin. In the right margin, Harold had written in pencil in his small, precise hand, "EST future val. 30-40x. Gerald was reading over Dorothy's shoulder. He said, 30 to 40 times what he paid. Dorothy looked at the index cards in the open cases along the shelving. She thought about Harold at an estate sale table in 1991, sitting in a church fellowship hall somewhere or a farmhouse or a sale barn, looking at 6 silver coins in a dealer's tray and writing a number in the margin of a card that no one else at that table would have written. She said, he was right about most things. After the coin cases, Catherine moved to the low shelving along the near wall. She took a scale from her hard-sided case, a precise digital instrument with a tare function, and she set it on the shelf. She lifted one of the rectangular objects and set it on the scale. She noted the weight. She examined the hallmark stamp with her loupe, reading the assay number and the refiner's mark. She set the object back on the shelf and lifted a second one from a different row. Gerald had not taken his eyes off the shelving since Catherine began this portion of the work. He said, "I know what those are." Catherine said, "Yes. These are gold bullion bars, London Good Delivery Standard. Each bar 400 troy ounces. The hallmarks indicate production by accredited refiners, which means they are accepted on the spot market without requiring additional assay testing." She looked at the 3 shelf units, at the rows and stacks. She counted the visible objects. She made notes. She said, I am counting approximately 240 bars from here. A full formal inventory would give a precise number. At current spot price, which as of this week is in the range of $3,200 per troy ounce, 400 troy ounces per bar times 240 bars puts you in the range of $307 million for the bullion alone. Gerald sat down on the floor again. Dorothy did not say anything. She let the number sit in the room the way Harold had always let numbers sit before he spoke about them. She thought about the number, and she thought about what it was and what it was not. It was not luck. It was not a windfall. It was Harold buying 400 troy ounces at a time from the early 1980s onward, when gold traded between $300 and $500 per troy ounce, driving it here 4 hours on Saturdays, stacking it carefully in the rows she was looking at, returning the following month for another load. It was the difference between a figure and a fortune, which was 40 years, and the willingness to carry something for 40 years without telling anyone you were carrying it. Catherine said, if the bulk of this was purchased between 1982 and 2002, when gold averaged significantly below today's prices, your husband paid somewhere in the range of $30 to $60 million for what is on these shelves. At today's price, the appreciation is roughly 5 to 1 on the lower end. Dorothy said, he understood load-bearing. Catherine looked at her. She said, I am sorry. Dorothy said, he was an engineer. He understood what structures could hold over time if they were built right. He applied it to everything. Catherine nodded slowly. She looked at the rows of bars on the shelving, and then she looked at the paintings on the far wall, and then she looked at the 117 cases running from 1979 to the spring of the year Harold died. She said, yes. I think that describes what I am looking at in this room. In the afternoon, they opened 3 of the metal containers on the central pallets. The first held documents, certificates, treasury instruments, bearer bonds from financial institutions that had since been reorganized or absorbed. Harold's index card listed the face values and maturity dates of each instrument in the same careful handwriting as the coin cards, each one accompanied by the date he had acquired it and what he had paid. Catherine examined the documents in the first container. She said, bearer bonds and treasury instruments are not my specific area of certification, and I want to be careful here. But the face values on what I can read in this container alone run to approximately $4 million. She looked at the rows of containers on the pallets. I count 41 containers. I cannot tell you without opening each one what the others contain. But if the average is comparable to this first one, you are looking at a substantial sum in addition to the bullion and the coins and the art. Gerald was still on the floor. He said, what does substantial mean in this context? Catherine said, the face value of the instruments in this first container is 4 million. 41 containers. If they are comparable, you are looking at somewhere in the range of $160 million in additional instruments. That figure is extremely preliminary and subject to formal accounting. Some of these instruments may have matured and need to be reissued. Some may involve legal considerations around the bearer bond structure, which was phased out in the United States. This piece will require a financial attorney and a forensic accountant working through each container one at a time. Dorothy said, all right. She said it the way Harold said things when they were settled. Gerald put his face in both hands. He sat on his father's concrete floor with his face in his hands and his coat still on, and Dorothy stood beside the open container and let him have it. He was 48 years old, and she was 71, and she had known since Wednesday that this was coming, had had a week to begin assembling what it meant, and he had had this afternoon. She let him have the afternoon. After a while she said, Gerald. He did not take his hands down. She said, your father did not do this so you could sit on the floor. He made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something else. She said, he did this so that we would know what to do next. He left the tool bucket and the list and the notes on the index cards and the reference prices because he wanted us to be able to understand what he had built. He did not spend 40 years on this so that we could sit on the floor when we found it. Gerald took his hands down. His eyes were wet in the way they had been wet twice before in his life that she had seen. Once at his grandmother's funeral when he was 14, and once in the hospital corridor the morning his son was born, and on neither of those occasions had he looked quite the way he looked now. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he had not expected to be and who was finding out that the view from it was not what he would have predicted. He said, Pamela told you it was a hole in the ground. Dorothy said, "Yes, she did." He said, "I let her say it. I did not correct her." Dorothy said, "No, you did not." He said, "Mom, I am sorry." She looked at him sitting on the cold floor of his father's bunker. She looked at the shelving running from 1979 to the spring of the year his father died. She looked at the paintings and the palettes and the bars of gold bullion in their careful rows. She said, "When you have stood up, I am going to need help. Catherine needs a second set of hands for the remaining inventory, and I have 2 knees that have been on concrete long enough today. So stand up when you are ready." He stood up. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He crossed the room to where Catherine was waiting beside the shelving with her notebook and her camera and her 26 years of knowing exactly what to do in a room like this one. And he said, "Tell me what you need." Catherine told him. He did it. They worked for another 2 hours. Gerald and Catherine worked through the remaining open cases and counted the visible objects across the full extent of the low shelving and cataloged the containers on the pallets. Dorothy sat at the tool bucket in Harold's chair, which was a milk crate he had left beside the bucket for exactly this purpose, and she wrote in Harold's notepad with Harold's pen. She wrote down everything Catherine said, and she wrote her own questions beside it. And she wrote the names of specialists Catherine mentioned, the Bingham scholar at a St. Louis museum, and the Heed specialist in Boston, and the numismatic law attorney in New York who handled complex coin provenance questions, and the financial attorney in Louisville who did forensic estate accounting. For names on the first page of Harold's notepad in her own handwriting. At 4 in the afternoon, Catherine sat down across from Dorothy on the concrete and opened her leather notebook. She said, "I want to be clear that everything I am about to tell you is preliminary. Formal appraisal of a collection of this type takes considerably more time than a single afternoon. Nothing I say now constitutes a formal valuation opinion." Dorothy said she understood. Catherine said, "I also want to say that in 26 years of estate appraisal, I have not walked into a room like this one. I have seen large collections. I have seen private holdings of art and substantial bullion positions and significant coin collections. I have not seen all 3 combined in one place, in this condition, with this level of internal documentation, assembled over this span of time. Whatever your husband was, he was exact, and he was patient, and he had an ability to identify value in things that other people had walked past. That combination, over 40 years, produces results that are very difficult to describe without the full accounting in front of you." Dorothy said, "He had that quality since I first knew him." Catherine nodded. She looked at her notebook. She said, "My preliminary assessment of what I have seen this afternoon, applying current market conditions and the best professional judgment I can offer without the formal process completed, puts the total value of this collection in the range of $460 million to $510 million. The ventilation system moved the air in its steady measure. The climate control display held its numbers. Gerald said the range out loud, the way you say something to see if saying it changes it. It did not change. Catherine said, "That is preliminary, and pending formal appraisal of each category. The bullion is the most straightforward to value because it is a commodity with a current spot price. The coins and the art will require specialist appraisals that take time. The financial instruments will require legal and accounting work before they can be formally assessed. But yes, 460 to 510 million is where the preliminary assessment sits." Dorothy looked at her notepad, at the 4 names she had written on the first page, at the questions she had written beside each name. She said, "All right." She said it the way Harold said things when they were settled, and the settling was enough for now. Then she closed the notepad and put the cap back on the pen and stood up from the milk crate because her knees had been on the concrete long enough. They locked the door in the early dark. Dorothy worked the combination and the bolts drove home, and the 3 of them walked back across the clearing to their vehicles. Catherine said she would send a preliminary written summary within the week and would coordinate with the specialists Dorothy had noted. She shook their hands, got in her truck, and drove back down the gravel drive through the locusts. Gerald drove north. They were off the county road before dark. For the first 30 miles he drove without speaking in the way of a man who has been given more than one thing to carry and is deciding the order of the carrying. Then he said, "I need to call Pamela." Dorothy said, "Yes. I expect you do." He drove another few miles. He said, "I do not know how to begin." She said, "You begin with the number. You say the number first, before anything else, because if you say the other things before the number it will seem like you are softening it, and the number is not something that needs softening. It is just a number. Say it plainly. He called from the car on the speaker. The phone rang twice, and Pamela answered, and Gerald told her plainly, the way Dorothy had said. He said the paintings and the coins and the gold and the financial instruments. He said the preliminary assessment. He said the range, $460 million to $510 million. He said all of it without softening any of it. On the other end of the line, Pamela was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Dorothy, are you there? Dorothy said she was there. Pamela said, I told you it was a hole in the ground. Dorothy said, yes, you did. Another silence. The highway went under them in the dark. Pamela said, I want you to know I am genuinely sorry for that. I know it does not take the words back. Dorothy said, no, it does not take them back. Pamela said, will you let me come next time? To the bunker. Dorothy thought about Harold in the room at the end of the corridor, packing each case with acid-free tissue, writing the index cards in his small, precise hand, building the rows across 40 years for the person he had been building them for. She thought about what he had built and who he had intended it for, and what he would have said about who should be allowed to see it. She said yes. You can come next time. Pamela said, thank you. She said it the way a person says it when they know they are being given something they are not certain they deserve. They drove the rest of the way in silence, the highway unreeling in the headlights, the exits going past in green. Gerald pulled into her driveway and waited until she was inside and the kitchen light was on. She stood in the kitchen with her coat still on for a moment, in the room where she had made Harold's coffee every morning for 49 years, looking at the countertop and the stove and the window over the sink. Then she took the coat off and hung it on Harold's peg by the door, which she had been using since March because it was the one closest to the door, and that was what pegs were for. She went to Harold's desk. She sat in his chair, and she opened the middle drawer and took out the backup notepad he had always kept there, and she copied the 4 names from the field notepad onto the top page in clean handwriting. The Bingham scholar, the Heed specialist, the numismatic law attorney, the financial estate accountant. She wrote them in a column with space below each name for the information she did not yet have. She closed the notepad and set it on the desk beside the tin of cough drops Harold had not touched in 3 years. She sat in his chair in the quiet office, and she thought about what Catherine Lyle had said that afternoon. She had said, whatever your husband was, he was exact, and he was patient, and he had an ability to identify value in things that other people had walked past. Dorothy had thought at the time that Catherine was describing Harold's relationship with coins and paintings and gold. She had thought this and had known immediately that she was also describing something else entirely, something that had happened in a room at a party in Louisville in 1971 when Harold had stood at the edge of the room for 20 minutes watching a woman in a blue dress talk to someone else entirely before he had walked across to her and introduced himself. She had asked him once why he had waited so long. He had said he had been deciding whether what he was looking at was what he thought it was, and he had decided that it was, and then he had come over. She had thought at the time that it was a strange way for a man to describe how he met his wife. She turned off the desk lamp. She went to bed. She lay on Harold's side of the mattress in the dark, and she listened to the house settle around her, the same house that had been settling around her for 34 years, the same sounds in the same sequence, the furnace and the pipes, and the particular voice of the front step when the temperature dropped below freezing. She thought about 4 names on a notepad. She thought about what the next months were going to require. Specialists and attorneys and accountants and auction experts and the patience to work through 117 cases and 41 containers and 14 paintings and 240 bars of gold bullion and whatever Harold had put in the cases and containers she had not yet opened. She thought about all of it, and she was not afraid of any of it. She had been managing things since Harold died, poorly at first, and then better, and she had been managing things since long before that in the way that the person in a partnership who pays the closest attention to the work always manages things, which is not from the front or from the top, but from the place where the full picture is visible. Harold had left her the full picture. He had drawn it one piece at a time over 40 years in a room in a Kentucky hillside, and he had left her the tools to read it. She would begin reading it tomorrow after the bird feeder was filled. She had decided that on the drive home somewhere past London, and she held it as a fixed point in the dark. The bird feeder first, and then the first name on the list, because some things you do in a certain order not because the order is logical, but because the order is yours and you have earned it. The house settled. The furnace ran. Somewhere outside in the backyard, the bird feeder stood empty in the November dark, waiting for morning. She closed her eyes. She slept harder than she had in 8 months and 11 days. She called the first name on the Monday morning after the second visit, before she filled the bird feeder and before she made coffee, because she had woken early and the waiting was already louder than the cold outside the window. The number went to voicemail. She left a careful message giving her name and saying she had a collection of American paintings she believed included works by George Caleb Bingham and Martin Johnson Head, that she had come to these paintings through her husband's estate, and that she would like to discuss a formal appraisal. She said she understood these things took time and that she did not expect a call back immediately. The specialist called back in 40 minutes. His name was Dr. Marcus Pfeiffer, and he held the Calkins Chair in American Art at the St. Louis Art Museum. He asked her 3 questions. When he had her answers, he said, in the measured voice of a man who had learned over a long career to keep his register even when his register did not want to be even, that he would like to see the paintings at her earliest convenience. He said earliest. He said it with a stress that was not quite urgency, but was something adjacent to it. Dorothy said she could arrange Saturday if that worked. He said Saturday would work. She filled the bird feeder after the call. The cardinal came in 11 minutes. The week moved the way weeks move when there is real work being done toward a fixed point. Not slowly, not quickly, but with the particular substance of time that is being used well. She called the numismatic law attorney in New York on Tuesday and the financial estate accountant in Louisville on Wednesday. By Thursday, she had spoken to all 4 names on the notepad, and all 4 had agreed to be at the bunker on Saturday. Gerald was driving down with Pamela. Catherine Lyle was coming back as coordinator. Dr. Pfeiffer was flying into Lexington Friday evening and renting a car. She packed a thermos and 2 sandwiches on Saturday morning and made enough for whoever needed them. They went in 3 vehicles. Dorothy and Gerald and Pamela in the Volvo, Catherine in her white truck, Dr. Pfeiffer and the coins specialist Arthur Greer, a man from Louisville who had been certifying rare coins for 31 years, in the rental car from Lexington. They parked at the end of the gravel drive in the clearing just before 9 in the morning. Pamela had not spoken much on the drive. She had sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap and her coat buttoned to the throat, and she had looked out the window at the ridges coming up around them, and she had not said the things Dorothy had half expected about the logistics or the distance or the practicalities of the day. She had said, near Corbin, that the mountains were beautiful. She had said it the way a person says something they should have noticed sooner and knows it. In the clearing, she got out of the Volvo, and she looked at the bunker, and she looked at the path worn into the frost-burned grass, and then she looked at Dorothy, and she said, "Did he walk that path every time?" "Yes," Dorothy said. Pamela pressed her lips together and nodded once and said, "All right." She said it the same way Dorothy had said it in the bunker the week before, with the flatness of a person who has finished arguing with a thing and accepted it fully. The old man was already there. He was sitting on the tailgate of a green pickup truck parked on the far side of the clearing near the tree line, the kind of truck that had been working for 20 years and looked it. He was in his early 70s with white hair under a dark cap and a canvas coat that had seen a great many Kentucky winters. He did not get up when they pulled in. He watched them park and get out with the patient stillness of a man who has learned that most things worth seeing are worth waiting to see clearly. Dorothy walked across the clearing to him. He watched her come. She said, "I am Dorothy Calloway. This is Harold's property." He said, "I know who you are." He had the particular voice of a man from these mountains, the consonants shaped by the ridge and the hollow. He said, "My name is Earl Combs. I live about 3 miles east on the county road. I did road maintenance and exterior work on this property for Harold for about 30 years on and off, whenever he called for it. He said your name to me once, just the once. He said it in the context of this is all for her, meaning you. Then he did not say anything else about it, and I did not ask." Dorothy looked at him. She said, "He said that to you." Earl said, he was not a talkative man. When he said something, it tended to stay said. He looked past her at the bunker entrance and then back at her. "When his truck stopped coming past on the county road last spring, I knew. I have been coming out here every few weeks since then just to walk the perimeter and make sure the door was holding and the drainage ditches were not filling in. Nobody asked me to. I did not figure that was a reason not to." Dorothy looked at the man on the tailgate. She thought about Harold in March. She thought about the last Sunday of his life, which she had no way of knowing was the last. Sunday until it was already the morning after, and on which he had filled the bird feeder and drunk his coffee at the window, and said nothing out of the ordinary, because there was nothing ordinary to say. She said, "Will you come inside today?" Earl looked at the bunker entrance. He said, "In 30 years Harold never asked me inside. I figured there was a reason for that." "There was," Dorothy said. "But it is past now. Come inside today if you would like to." He thought about it for a moment with the genuine deliberation of a man who does not make small decisions carelessly. Then he got down from the tailgate and set his thermos cup in the truck bed and came across the clearing with the unhurried walk of a man who has lived in mountains his whole life and has stopped being surprised by what they contain. Inside the bunker, in the lit room with the work lights and the climate control and the 117 cases on the shelving, Earl Combs stood very still. He looked at the shelving and the paintings and the palettes. He looked at the low shelving along the near wall. He turned slowly from one end of the room to the other the way Gerald had turned on the first day, taking it in the way a man takes in something that is larger than he had prepared for. He said, "He did all of this." Dorothy said, "Over 40 years, yes." Earl looked at the shelving cases running from 1979 to the spring of the year Harold died. He said, "I re-graveled that drive in 1987 and again in 2001 and again in 2014. He always paid in cash, and he always shook my hand, and he always sat on the tailgate of his truck eating his lunch and looking at the ridge before he went inside. He never told me what he was doing in here. I never asked because I could see he was a man who had a reason for everything he did, and it was not my business to know the reason." Earl was quiet for a moment. He said, "I would have liked to have known him better. I think most people would have, if they had understood what kind of man he was." Dorothy said, "Yes, I think they would have." She let that sit the way Harold let things sit. Then she said, "Come over here, and I will show you what he built." Pamela had not said much since they entered the building. She had followed the group through the corridor and through the second door, and she had stood at the entrance to the main room, and she had looked at what Harold Calloway had built, and then she had walked to the far wall. Not to the paintings. To the space of floor below the paintings, where the wear pattern on the concrete was visible. The subtle difference in surface color where the same path had been crossed 10,000 times between the door and this wall. She crouched down and looked at it at eye level, the way a person looks at something they need to understand from the right angle. Then she stood back up, and she did not say anything for a long time. Later, in the car on the way home, she said to no one in particular, "He walked from that door to those paintings so many times that you can see it in the floor." Gerald said, "Yes." Pamela said, "I called it a hole in the ground." Gerald did not answer this. She looked out the passenger window at the dark ridges going past for a while. Then she said, "I always make the same calculation. Whether the thing is worth the trouble it is going to be. And I made it on the wrong terms. I did not know the terms because I did not know what Harold was doing with his Saturdays. Nobody knew." Dorothy said, "Most people would not have known." Pamela said, "I know. I am telling you anyway because I want you to know that I know what I said and why I said it, and that I was wrong. Not about the logistics. About what matters." Dorothy thought about that for a mile or two. Then she said, "Harold never corrected me when I made the wrong calculation about something. He just kept building until the right answer was visible." Pamela was quiet for the rest of the drive north, and Dorothy let her be. Back in the bunker on that Saturday morning, Dr. Marcus Pfeiffer had set up his workspace at the far wall with a raking light lamp and a portable infrared scanner and reference materials on a tablet. He worked with the focus of a man who has been waiting his whole career to stand in a room like this one, and who is not going to let the weight of that fact waste a minute. He spent the most time on the Bingham. He scanned it. He raked the light across it in slow passes. He photographed it from multiple distances and compared the signature to authenticated reference examples. He looked at the stretcher bars and the canvas weave and the craquelure pattern of the aged paint surface. He straightened up and said to Dorothy, "This is genuine. I have no doubt. The signature is consistent with authenticated examples from this period of his work. The craquelure is consistent with the age of the canvas. The pigments are consistent with the palette he was using in this period. This is a major Bingham." He looked at the painting for another moment before speaking again. "I have seen 4 Binghams in private hands in my career. I have never seen one in this condition." He moved to the heat. He spent 27 minutes with it. He said, "Also genuine." He said it with the flatness of certainty that does not need decoration. He said, "The heat is in museum-quality condition. The climate control in this room explains that. Whoever set this up understood exactly what these paintings needed. He looked at the temperature display on the wall. Your husband was maintaining optimal conditions for 19th century oil on canvas for how long? Dorothy said, from whenever he installed the system. Based on the equipment, I would estimate at least 30 years. Pfeiffer looked at the display, and then at the paintings, and then at the room around him. He said, your husband was protecting the value of what he had here. Dorothy said, he was protecting what he had built. Pfeiffer looked at her for a moment. He said yes. That is the better way to say it. He moved along the wall to the remaining 12 paintings. He stopped at the third one from the right end, a smaller canvas showing a wooded interior with a fall of light coming through the trees onto the forest floor. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, and then he looked at the painting beside it, and then he looked at the first one again. He said, Mrs. Calloway, do you know how your husband priced these when he bought them? She said she did not know the specific amounts. She said she would likely find the purchase records in his notes once she had worked through all the cases. Pfeiffer said, I asked because the way this collection was assembled is not the way a person assembles a collection when they are buying names. He paused. Your husband was not buying Bingham because Bingham was famous. He was buying these paintings because he recognized something in them. That is a different kind of collector. That is the kind of collector who finds the thing that was missed consistently over many years, which is a very rare and very particular talent. I have spent 30 years in this field, and I can count on one hand the private collectors I have known who had that quality. He looked at the far wall again. Your husband had it. Dorothy thought about Harold at estate sales for 40 years, about his magnifying glass in the tool bucket, about the index cards and the penciled estimates in the right margins. She said, he had time to develop it. Pfeiffer said, time is not enough on its own. There are people who attend estate sales for 40 years and come home with nothing worth keeping. He had something else as well. He had an eye that trusted itself. Arthur Greer had set up at the shelving cases with a portable light and his own scale and reference materials. He worked through the cases the way Catherine had the week before, but more thoroughly, opening each case, inventorying against the index card Harold had left inside, checking each piece against its certification. He found no discrepancies anywhere in the 117 cases. Every certification matched every coin it covered. Every index card was accurate to what was in the case. He said to Dorothy, at one point in the afternoon, your husband's record-keeping is the cleanest I have seen in 31 years of this work. Every piece is accounted for. Every acquisition date is recorded. Every price paid is noted. He has left a paper trail that will significantly reduce the time and cost of the formal appraisal process because we are not starting from nothing. We are confirming what he already knew and had already written down. Dorothy said, he was an engineer. Greer said, yes. I can see that. He opened case 31 and looked at the 1933 double eagle for a long time. He called Margaret Tolliver, the coin loss specialist from New York, over to look at it. They spoke in the technical language of their field for several minutes. Then Margaret Tolliver said to Dorothy that the provenance documentation placed the acquisition in 1998, after the legal framework around surviving 1933 double eagles had been substantially clarified. She said they would need to work through the full documentation before she could give a formal legal opinion, but that her preliminary read was that Harold had been careful about this and that careful, in her experience of this man's records, appeared to mean thorough. It was Dorothy who found the container. She had been working her way through the pallets in the center of the room while the specialists worked the shelving and the paintings, opening containers with the putty knife from the tool bucket, inventorying the contents against the index cards. Judith Harden, the financial accountant, had been working alongside her, cataloging the financial instruments with the quiet competence of someone genuinely good at a thing she had done for a long time. The last container on the last pallet was the one Harold had added in the spring before he died. The date was on the label in his handwriting. But where the other containers each had a label that included a brief content summary, this one's label had only the date and a single word beneath it. Last, Dorothy stood beside the pallet and looked at the label. She picked up the putty knife. She worked the seal. She opened the clasp. Inside the container, on top of the contents she would inventory later with Judith Harden, was a small notebook. Leather cover, the size of a paperback book, the kind of notebook a man buys once and uses with care over many years. The cover was soft from being held, and the spine was creased from being opened and closed many times. On the front cover, in Harold's handwriting, was her name. Below her name, a date. Not a year, just the date. May 14th, their anniversary. She picked it up. She looked across the room at Gerald standing at the shelving with Arthur Greer, at Pamela near the paintings with Dr. Pfeiffer, at Earl Combs near the far wall, watching everything in the patient way of a man who has decided to be useful by staying out of the way. She sat down on the milk crate beside the pallet. She opened the notebook. The first entry was dated March 1979. It said, "Drove down today for the first time since the deed cleared. Walked the full perimeter. The structure is sound. It is going to need work to be what I have in mind, but the bones are right. I have been thinking about this since Gerald was born, and I believe I have it figured out. Dottie will think I am at the hardware store tomorrow when I drive to the bank. That is all right. Some things take a long time to explain properly, and the middle is not the time to explain them." Dorothy read this twice. Then she turned the page. The second entry was dated September 1979, for months later. He had bought the first 20 coins. He described the estate sale in Elizabethtown, a woman selling her late husband's effects from a table in the fellowship hall of a Baptist church. He wrote, "She did not know what she had. I paid what she asked because she was selling her husband's things, and a woman selling her husband's things deserves not to be haggled with. I did not write down her name, and now I wish I had. I would like her to know that what she sold that afternoon is safe, and that it will stay safe, and that the reason for that is standing a few feet away right now eating a sandwich and thinking about something else." Dorothy looked up from the notebook. The room went on around her. Pfeiffer at the paintings. Greer and Tolliver at the coin cases. Judith Harden at the financial instruments. She read the line again. "The reason for that is standing a few feet away right now eating a sandwich and thinking about something else." She had been a few feet away from Harold at estate sales and hardware stores and on Saturday mornings for 46 years. She had been a few feet away and thinking about something else, which was exactly what he had needed her to be doing. She turned the pages. The entries were not dated regularly. Some years had 3 or 4. Some had 1. A few years in the early 1990s had none, which she understood was the period of Gerald's wedding and the grandchildren arriving, years when the demands on a Saturday were different, and Harold had attended those demands without complaint. In 1984, he wrote about a painting at a Shelbyville auction. He described it in the shorthand of a man who had been educating himself about American painters through the reading of many books in the evenings when other people watched television. He wrote, "The auctioneer called it landscape with river and priced it accordingly. I have been reading about Bingham for about a year. I believe this is a study for one of his major river compositions. I paid $340. I may be wrong. I do not believe I am wrong." He had not been wrong. 40 years, and one art historian from St. Louis later, he had not been wrong. In 1991, he wrote about Gerald asking what he was doing on Saturdays. He wrote, "I told him the hardware store. I felt a small discomfort about this that lasted until I was on the highway, and then it did not last anymore, because Gerald will understand it when the time comes, and the understanding at that point will be better than any explanation I could give him now. A person who has not yet needed something cannot fully understand why it was built for them." Dorothy thought about Gerald sitting on the floor of this room twice in the same afternoon 2 weeks ago. Harold had been right about that, too. In the fall of 2001, in the weeks after the attacks in New York, when everyone was thinking about what endured and what did not, Harold had written, "I drove down on Saturday and sat in the room for a while without doing anything. Just sat in it. I have been thinking about whether this is the right thing to do, spending Saturdays this way when there are other things I could be doing with the time and the money. I came to the same answer I always come to when I ask the question, which is that the whole point of building something for a person is that you do it while they are still here and not yet in need of it. You do not wait until the need has arrived. You build when you are able, and you trust the building to be ready when the need comes. I am going to keep building." She read that entry 3 times. In 1998, she found the entry about the 1933 Double Eagle. He had spent 2 paragraphs on the coin and its legal history and the provenance documentation and the dealer in Chicago. Then he wrote, "This is the finest individual piece in the room. It took 11 years to find one with clean papers, and 11 years is not very long when you consider that some people spend their whole lives looking for a thing like this and do not find it. The room is nearly what I wanted it to be." She turned pages. Near the end of the notebook, from a few years before Harold died, she found an entry longer than most. It was dated a Sunday in November, which she could tell from the context was the November after she had had a small health scare that had turned out to be nothing but had been frightening for about a week. She remembered that week. She remembered Harold being quieter than usual in the evenings and not explaining why. He had written, "I sat with the idea last night that I might not be there when she finds this. I have sat with it before, but this week it was louder than usual. I want to say something about that for her to read if that is how it happens. Dottie, if you are reading this, and I am not there to sit beside you while you do, I want you to know that I built this room from the beginning for exactly that possibility. Not because I did not expect to be there. I expected to be there. I have always expected things to go the way I planned them. But I am an engineer, and an engineer plans for the load the structure must bear if the primary support is removed. You are the structure, Dottie. This room is what I built under you, so that if the primary support was removed, the structure would hold. It will hold. I made sure of it." Dorothy put her hand over her mouth. The room around her went on with its work. She did not cry. She had promised herself on the drive to Kentucky the first time that this room was for understanding, and she had kept the promise through 2 visits, and she was going to keep it now. But she pressed her hand against her mouth for 30 seconds, and she let herself have those 30 seconds fully, without apology and without moving, because 30 seconds was what it required, and she was not going to give it less than that. Then she took her hand down. She turned the last page. The last entry was dated the spring before Harold died. The same spring as the last case on the shelving. He had been here in the spring before he died, and he had written a final entry and sealed the notebook in the last container and driven the 4 hours home and said nothing. He had come home and eaten dinner and watched the evening news and come to bed at his usual time, and she had not known. The entry was 5 sentences. The specialists are named on the envelope in this container. I have done the research so that Dottie does not have to start from nothing. The total value of what is in this room, by my most recent calculation, is somewhere between $400 and $500 million. I have tried to be conservative in this estimate. The only thing I have ever needed to give her was the room to do it in, and the room is ready." Dorothy read those 5 sentences 4 times. Gerald was standing beside her. She had not heard him cross the room, but he was there, and she let him read over her shoulder without looking up, and she held the notebook open until she knew he had read it through. He said, "The room to do it in." She said yes. He said, "He called 4 to 500 million conservative." She said, "Your father was an engineer." Conservative meant leaving room for the calculation to be wrong and still have everything hold. Gerald read the last sentence one more time. He put his hand on his mother's shoulder. He did not say anything else because there was not anything else to say that the room had not already said. Inside the container, beneath where the notebook had rested, was a small white envelope. It said on the front, in Harold's handwriting, "For when you need names." Inside were 4 names with phone numbers and brief descriptions. A Bingham and Head specialist at a St. Louis museum. A numismatic attorney in New York. A financial estate accountant in Louisville. The 4th was Catherine Lyle, described simply as estate appraisal, Louisville, reliable. Dorothy looked at the 4 names on Harold's list. She looked at the 4 names on her own notepad that she and Gerald and Catherine had assembled independently the week after the second visit. They were the same 4 names. She had found the right people without his note. She had found them on her own from a standing start in November, and Harold had written down the same names at some point in the years before he died, because he had known she would need them and had prepared accordingly, and she had found them anyway, because she was the person he had believed she was when he built the room for her. She folded the envelope and put it in her coat pocket. She would tell Gerald about it later, when the mountains were falling away behind them, and there was room around the telling. For now she put the notebook back in the container and stood up from the milk crate and went to help Judith Harden with the remaining inventory. Judith Harden's formal accounting of the financial instruments, completed over the following 6 weeks, put the total face value of the bearer bonds and treasury instruments at $163 million, after accounting for maturation and reissuance. Arthur Greer's formal numismatic appraisal put the certified coin collection at $84 million, with the 1933 Double Eagle carrying a formal preliminary value of $19.2 million pending the completion of the legal provenance review. Dr. Pfeiffer's formal art appraisal, completed with 2 additional specialists he brought in from New York for the paintings he had been less certain about, put the 14 paintings at $131 million, the Bingham at $16.4, and the Head at $23.1, and the remaining 12 ranging from 2.8 to 9.3. The gold bullion, when formally counted and weighed, came to 246 bars, 6 more than Catherine had counted from across the room on the first visit. At the spot price on the day the formal inventory was completed, the bullion was worth $311 million. Catherine Lyle submitted her formal appraisal report on a Tuesday afternoon in February, for months after Dorothy had first found the envelope in Harold's desk drawer. The report was 43 pages. The total on the first page, adding the coins and the art and the bullion and the financial instruments, was $489 million. Harold had estimated $400 to $500 million and called it conservative. He had been right, and he had been conservative, in the way he was right and conservative about everything he had ever built, which was by leaving room for the estimate to be wrong and still having everything hold. Dorothy read the first page of the report 3 times at Harold's desk. Then she set it beside his notepad and the tin of cough drops and went to fill the bird feeder because it was a Tuesday morning and the feeder needed filling. She stood at the kitchen window, and the cardinal came while she was still there, the same male she saw most mornings now, brilliant red in the February light, landing on the tray with the particular authority of a creature that knows it belongs somewhere. She watched it for a long time. Gerald and Pamela came that evening. Gerald made pasta because Gerald made pasta when he needed to do something with his hands and did not know what else to do with them, which Dorothy had observed about him since he was 15 and had never mentioned. They sat at the kitchen table, and Dorothy set the 43-page report in the center, and Gerald looked at the first page, and he did not put his face in his hands. He sat with it the way Harold had always sat with things, in the deliberate stillness of a person letting something become real before speaking about it. Pamela poured the wine. She set a glass in front of Dorothy and one in front of Gerald, and kept one for herself. She sat down, and she said, "What are you going to do with it?" Dorothy had been thinking about this since November. She had been thinking about it in the way you think about something genuinely new to you, not by solving it, but by living alongside it until the shape of it becomes clear enough to act. She said, "I am going to do several things, and I am going to do them in the right order." She said, "The house stays. This is my house and Harold's house, and I am not leaving it for any reason." Gerald, the conversation about assisted living is over. Gerald said, "The conversation is over." She said, "I am setting up a trust for you and your children. The estate attorney has the structure ready. It is not everything, and it is not most of it, but it is enough that none of you will ever have to make a decision from a position of financial fear, and that is what Harold would have wanted for his son." Gerald looked at the table. He said, "Mom, you do not have to do that." She said, "I know I do not have to. I am choosing to, because Harold spent 40 years building something that was meant to land in the family. You are the family." Pamela reached across the table and put her hand over Dorothy's. She did not say anything. She had been saying less and meaning more since November, and Dorothy had noticed this and had not remarked on it, because it did not need remarking on. Dorothy set a piece of paper in the center of the table beside the report. She had written on it herself, in her own handwriting, not Harold's. It said at the top, "The Harold Calloway Foundation." Below that, one sentence, "For the children of coal country, so that where they begin is not where they end." She said, "Harlan County has been in economic hardship for 40 years. The same 40 years Harold was driving down there on Saturdays. I do not know whether he chose that county for the land price or for another reason. I know that the people there maintained his road and served him coffee and watched over his property after he was gone, and that Earl Combs came to that clearing every few weeks for 8 months without being asked and without telling anyone, and that the right thing to do with part of what Harold built in those mountains is to leave something behind in them. Education grants," she said. "Scholarships for students in Harlan County for college and trade school. Not complicated. Not conditional on anything other than the wanting to go. Just money, available, for the children of a place that has not had enough of it for too long." Gerald said he would have wanted that. He said it quietly and without uncertainty. She said, "I believe he would have." She thought about Harold on his tailgate, eating his lunch and looking at the ridge. She thought about Earl Combs coming to the clearing for 8 months after Harold died, on his own, without being asked, because there was no other reason needed than that it was right. She said, "I want Earl Combs on the foundation board." He knew the property, and he knew Harold in the way men sometimes know each other from a distance and still know each other fully. Harold would have wanted a man like that to have a say in how it is used. Pamela said, "That is a good idea." Dorothy said, "I know." That was the closest she had come, in all of this, to something that felt like what she thought of as satisfaction. Not pleasure, not relief. Something quieter and more durable, the feeling of a thing being placed where it was always going. The foundation was established in April. Earl Combs said yes when she called him, in the simple way of a man agreeing to a thing he can see is right without needing more reason than that. The first scholarship letters went out before the end of the school year, 22 of them, to high school students in Harlan County who had applied through the school district office. 22 envelopes going to 22 households in the mountains Harold had driven through for 40 years without stopping except for coffee at the diner and a handshake with Earl at the edge of the gravel drive. Dorothy drove to Harlan County one more time in April, alone, the same way she had driven the first time. She met Earl at the diner. They sat at the counter with coffee in front of them, and the morning coming through the plate glass window and the ridges visible above the buildings across the street, bare still, but with the first suggestion of green beginning at the edges of the tree line. Earl said, "The last time Harold and I talked was the summer before he died. He was on the tailgate eating his lunch, and I had pulled in to check the road drainage on the south side of the drive. He did not ask me to stay, but he did not tell me to go. So I stood there a while, and we talked about the ridge and the dry summer and the logging operation on the next hill and whether it would cause runoff problems on the county road. Then he said, out of nowhere the way he said things, he said, 'Earl, the people out here are good people who have had a hard run of it. Seemed like it ought to be possible to do something about that.'" Earl looked at his coffee cup. He said, "I figured he was just talking. Men talk sometimes." He paused. "I think now he was not just talking." Dorothy said, "No, he was not just talking." Earl said, "Yes. I will sit on your board." She drove home in the late afternoon. The mountains fell away behind her, the ridges going from blue to gray to the first flat miles of plateau as the road dropped west. She had the windows cracked because April was warm enough and the air came through smelling of cut grass somewhere, and the cold water still running in the creek at the long straight stretch of county road she passed every time. She did not play the radio. She thought about Harold. She had been thinking about Harold since November in a different way than she had been thinking about him since March, and she was only now, in April, beginning to understand the difference clearly. Since March she had been thinking about his absence. The specific shape of the space he no longer occupied. The bird feeder and the chair and his side of the bed and all the small specific places in a shared life where a person's presence settles over time like silt in a riverbed, and from which it is taken when they go. Since November, she had been thinking about his presence. Not the presence she had lost, but the presence he had arranged to leave behind. The 40-year presence in a Kentucky hillside. The presence in a notebook with May 14th on the cover. The presence in an envelope with 4 names in it that were the same 4 names she had found on her own. There is a kind of love expressed in what you say to a person. There is another kind expressed in what you build for them while they are not looking, across the years when they are eating their sandwich and thinking about something else, and trusting you with the part of themselves that does not need to watch. Harold had both kinds. Dorothy understood now that the second kind was the one that could survive him, and that he had understood this, and that the understanding was what had sent him to a Kentucky hillside on Saturday mornings for 40 years. She thought about the 5 sentences on the last page of the notebook. "The only thing I have ever needed to give her was the room to do it in, and the room is ready." He had not said "I love you" in those sentences. He had never been a man who said it that way. He said it in the way he said everything that mattered, by building something that would hold when he could no longer be there to hold it himself. By calculating the load. By leaving room for the estimate to be wrong and still be all right. By driving 8 hours round trip on Saturdays for 40 years without asking anyone to notice or to thank him for it. She pulled into her driveway at 6:30. The lamp was on in the front room. She went in through the kitchen and hung her coat on Harold's peg by the door, which she had been using since March because it was the closest to the door, and that was what a peg was for. She went to the kitchen window. The bird feeder was empty. She had filled it in the morning, and the cardinals had been at it all day. She filled it again by the back door light, the seed going into the tray in the familiar sound of it, the tray spinning slightly on its hook in the evening air. She stood on the back step for a moment after. The sky was still pale in the west above the roofline. A single star was showing in the southeast. The neighborhood was quiet with the particular quiet of early evening. the smell of someone's dinner coming through an open window, and a dog at the far end of the block making its feelings about something known. She thought about a man who had stood at this same window every morning of his adult life looking out at this same yard. She thought about him deciding what kind of day he was going to have before anything from the outside world could complicate the deciding. She thought about what it meant that the yard was the same and the window was the same and the cardinal would come back in the morning the same way it had come back every morning since November, regular as a heartbeat, reliable as a thing that was built to be. She went inside. She made tea because it was late enough for tea and not for coffee. She took it to Harold's desk, and she sat in his chair, and she opened the desk drawer, and she took out the leather notebook with her name on the cover. She opened it to a page she had not yet given full attention. An entry from 2004. He had been at a farmhouse estate sale in Pulaski County and had found a painting the heirs had priced at $60 because it had been in the back bedroom, and nobody could say who had painted it, and they were clearing the house in a weekend and did not have time to find out. Harold had looked at it for about 20 minutes. He wrote, and then he had bought it. He wrote, "I could be wrong about this one. I have been wrong once in 25 years of this, and I may be wrong again. But there is something in the light in the upper left corner of this canvas that I have seen in only one other place, and that other place is on the far wall of the room in Kentucky, and I paid a great deal less than $60 for that one. I am putting them side by side on the wall, and we will see." Dorothy sat with this entry. She thought about Harold driving home from Pulaski County with a $60 painting and setting it on the far wall next to whatever he had already hung there and standing back and deciding. She thought about the 14 paintings on that wall, about Dr. Pfeiffer spending 27 minutes with the Heed, and what he had said about Harold's eye and the rarity of a private collector who trusted it the way Harold had trusted his across 40 years. She thought about what 40 years of standing back and deciding, one painting at a time, one Saturday morning at a time, looked like when it was finally fully assembled and lit by the work lights Harold had mounted and the climate control Harold had installed in a room Harold had built for the express purpose of holding it all until the person it was built for was ready to understand it. She turned the page. She kept reading. Outside the window, the first star had been joined by others, one at a time, each arriving in its own order over the neighbor's roofline. The lamp on the desk held its circle of light around her. The bird feeder stood on its post in the dark yard, full now, ready for morning. She read the way a person reads something written for them across a span of years they had been living through without knowing the writing was happening alongside them. She read slowly, one entry at a time, the way Harold had written it. One Saturday at a time, 1 year at a time for 40 years until the thing was finished and he had set it down. The furnace ran its cycle. The house settled around her in the same sequence it had settled in for 34 years. She turned a page. She kept reading. She finished the notebook on a Thursday evening in late April with the windows open and the smell of the yard coming through the screen. She read the final entry twice, the 5 sentences she had already read a dozen times, and then she closed the cover and set it on the desk beside the tin of cough drops and sat for a long time in the dark without turning the lamp back on. She had read the whole of it over 6 sittings spread across 6 weeks, not because she could not have read it faster, but because reading faster would have been the wrong way to read it. Harold had not written it fast. He had written it one Saturday at a time across 40 years, and the reading wanted to go the same way, deliberately, with time between sittings for what had been said to settle and become part of the ground before the next layer was laid down on top of it. She had understood this about the notebook from the first entry and had read accordingly. Now she was at the end of it, and she sat in the closed-off dark with the smell of the April yard coming through the screen and the house settling the way it settled every night in the same sequence, and she thought about what it meant to be at the end of a thing Harold had spent 40 years writing. What she felt was not sadness exactly. It was something in the neighborhood of sadness, the way a house is in the neighborhood of a river, close enough that the light and the sound reach you, but you are not in the water. She felt the weight of 40 years that she had been living through from one side while Harold had been living through from another. 2 people in the same life approaching it from angles that had never quite intersected until now, when the angle he had been standing at was the only one available, and she was standing in it alone. She thought about 1991, the entry where Gerald had asked about the Saturdays. Harold had said hardware store and felt a small discomfort that lasted until he was on the highway. She thought about that discomfort. She had known Harold for 53 years, and she had never once thought of him as a man who kept things from her. She did not think of him that way now. The notebook had made it clear, in the same way a well-drawn engineering diagram makes something clear, that what Harold had been keeping was not a secret in the sense of a concealment. It was a present he had not finished wrapping. You do not tell a person about a present before it is ready to give. The discomfort he had felt on the highway in 1991 was the particular discomfort of a man who loves his wife and knows that the truth of what he is doing is a better truth than the one he gave her, and who is holding the better truth until the right moment, which is a different thing entirely from hiding it. She understood this fully, and she had no difficulty with it. What she had difficulty with was smaller than that, and more specific. It was the entries from the late 1990s onward, the period when his hair had gone fully white, and he had started wearing reading glasses, and Gerald's oldest had been born, the period when Harold was past 60, and the room in the Kentucky hillside was largely what he had intended it to be. There were entries in those years that had a different tone than the earlier ones, less the planning entries of a man building something, and more the reflection entries of a man who had built it and was now keeping it company. He wrote about sitting in the room without doing anything. Just sitting. She had known Harold for all those years, and she had never known him to sit anywhere without doing something. She had never known him to go still in a room without a purpose for the stillness. That he had driven 4 hours on a Saturday to sit in a room in the Kentucky hillside without doing anything except being in it told her something about what the room had become to him over time that was not in any of the entries directly, but was in all of them together, the way a story is in the sentences without being in any one sentence. She thought he had been lonely in a particular way. Not lonely in the ordinary sense of wanting company. Lonely in the way of a person who is holding something large and has no one to hold it with yet. He had been building toward a moment, and the building was done, and the moment had not arrived, and he had been sitting in the finished room waiting for the arrival, which was its own kind of solitude that she had not known about, and could not have known about, and would not have understood if she had. She understood it now. She picked up the notebook and put it in the desk drawer. She sat for another moment in the dark, and then she turned the lamp on, and went to the kitchen and made tea and stood at the window with the cup in both hands looking out at the dark yard and the bird feeder she could barely see in the shape of the night. She thought about filling it in the morning. She thought about the cardinal who would come while she was standing at this window. She thought about how the cardinal had come every morning since November without fail, the same mail, the same red, the same landing with the same particular authority, and how she had stopped being surprised by it and started depending on it in the small specific way you depend on a thing that arrives when it says it will. She went to bed. She lay on Harold's side and listened to the house. She had not told Gerald about the envelope with the 4 names. She had mentioned it to Catherine Lyle in passing, and Catherine had said simply that she was not surprised, that a man who had kept records as precisely as Harold had kept records would have done the research on his specialist the same way he had done the research on everything else. Dorothy had filed this and had not said more about it, and the subject had not come up again. She thought about telling Gerald now. She thought about his face on the floor of the bunker when he had read the last 5 sentences over her shoulder, the face she had not seen before on him, the face of a man arriving somewhere he had not expected. She thought about what it would add to that face to know that she had found the right people on her own and that Harold had known she would. She thought that it would add something good to the face and that there would be a right moment for it, and that she would know the moment when it came. She fell asleep thinking about the cardinal. In the first week of May she signed the documents that established the Harold Calloway Foundation and the Family Trust, sitting in Franklin Webb's office on the 6th floor of a downtown Louisville building with a pale, May sky behind him. He was 35 years in estate law and the particular kind of attorney who understood that the legal instruments were usually the smaller part of what a client was sitting with when they came to sign them. He did not say a great deal beyond what was needed, and she appreciated this about him the same way she had always appreciated it about Harold. She drove home in the late afternoon. She had been paying attention more consistently since November to the light in the trees and the particular smell of the air when rain was coming and the sound of the furnace cycling through its sequence in the night. She thought it was possible that the notebook had given her something back that she had been losing slowly since March, a sense that the world had been arranged with more care than it sometimes appeared, that underneath the surface of ordinary days something was being built that would eventually become visible if you stayed long enough and paid close enough attention. She turned into the driveway. Gerald's Volvo was at the curb, which she had not expected. She went in through the kitchen and found him at the table with a cup of coffee in front of him and a folder open beside it. He looked up when she came in, and she could see from his face that he had been sitting there long enough to have thought something through to its end. She hung her coat on Harold's peg. She made herself a cup of tea and sat down across from him. He said, "I found something." She waited. He said, "I have been going through Dad's personal files. The ones in the bottom drawer of his desk that I asked you about in January, and you said I could look at when I was ready. I was ready this week." She said, and he said, "There is a letter in there. An unsent letter. No envelope, no address. Just a letter, folded twice, in a file folder with my name on the tab." He set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it without picking it up. He said, "It is addressed to me. I have read it. I would like you to read it too, if you are willing, but I want to ask first because it is to me and some of it is about me and I want to give you the choice." She said, "I would like to read it if you are willing to share it." He slid it across the table. The paper was the same graph paper block Harold had used for the bunker map, the fine green grid barely visible under the handwriting. The date at the top was from the spring before Harold died, close to the same period as the last entry in the notebook. He had been writing toward endings in those final months, she understood, with the particular urgency of a man who has always planned carefully and who understands that the window for his planning is narrowing. It said, "Gerald, there are things a father does not say to a son that he should say. I have been this kind of father in some ways and I have known it, and I have not corrected it, which is a failing I own without condition. You became the man you are through your own work and your mother's example, and I have watched you do it and been proud of you in ways I have expressed badly or not at all for 60 years. I am writing this down because the spoken version has always been difficult for me, which is my deficiency and not yours. You once asked me what I was doing on Saturdays. I told you the hardware store. I told you this for many years. The truth is in the room, which you now know. I want to tell you why I did not tell you the truth when you asked. It was not because I thought you would not understand it. You are your mother's son in the ways that matter, and you would have understood it eventually. It was because I was building something I had not finished, and the unfinished version was not ready to be seen. A thing half-built looks like waste, and looks like folly, and sometimes looks like nothing at all. I did not want you to see it half-built. I wanted you to see it when it was done, and I was not there to watch you see it. I am not there. You are seeing it. You are going to help your mother with this. I know you are because I know you. But I want to say to you directly what I have not said directly enough in 68 years, which is that you are capable of more than you have given yourself credit for, and I have watched you underestimate yourself at close range for 48 years, and I have not corrected it, which is another failing I own. You have your mother's judgment, and you have her patience, and you have an instinct for what matters that I have seen operate correctly your whole life, even when you did not trust it. Trust it. Do the work with your mother that needs doing, and trust the instinct. And do not let Pamela's calculation of the cost be the last word on any of it, because Pamela calculates from the front, and you know better, and I need you to act like you know better. I love you. I should have said that more clearly and more often. I am saying it now. Dorothy set the letter down. She looked at it on the table. She thought about Harold sitting at his desk in the spring before he died, writing this letter that he had not sent and had not sealed, and had put in a folder with Gerald's name on it as a tab in the bottom drawer. She thought about him calculating the loads. He had calculated that the bottom drawer letter was for Gerald to find and not for Dorothy to find, which was why he had not put it in the bunker with the notebook. He had calibrated evenness. He had understood what each person needed to receive and through which channel, and he had arranged accordingly. And he had been right in the way he was right about everything he arranged because he had spent a lifetime understanding the people around him with more precision than they understood themselves. She looked up at Gerald. His eyes were wet, but he was not crying. He was sitting the way Harold sat with things that needed sitting with. She said, "He knew what you needed to hear." Gerald said, "He always did. He just didn't say it out loud most of the time." She said, "He said it. It just went into the building." Gerald looked at the letter. He picked it up and folded it on the same creases it had been folded on and put it back in the folder with his name on the tab. He set the folder beside the coffee cup. He said, "Pamela read it." Dorothy waited. He said, "She said he was right about her. She said it in the way she says things when she knows they are true and is not going to spend any extra time around the edges of them." Dorothy said, "She has been saying less and meaning more since November. I have noticed." Gerald said, "I know. I have noticed too." They sat with the coffees and the tea in the ordinary kitchen in the ordinary late afternoon light, and the sounds of the neighborhood coming through the window screen, and outside the window the yard stood in the May light with the bird feeder on its post, and the grass growing the way grass grows in May in Louisville, fast and green, and with the particular confidence of something that has been here before and knows it belongs. She refilled his coffee. He did not ask her to. She did it because she had been doing it for 48 years, and it was one of the 1,000 small arrangements that make up a long life together, the kind that accumulate without anyone deciding on them. The way a path gets worn in a yard, not because someone laid it, but because two people kept walking the same way, and eventually the ground remembered. She thought about that path in the frost-burned grass of the clearing in eastern Kentucky. She thought about it in May, which she had not yet seen it in. She thought about how the frost would be gone and the grass would be growing and the path would still be there, worn into the ground by Harold's feet over how many crossings across how many years, and that it would still be there in 10 years and 20 years because that was what ground remembered when a person had walked the same way long enough. The ground kept the shape of the going even after the going had stopped. She thought this was perhaps the truest thing about Harold she had found in all of it. Not the room or the notebook or the $489 million and the foundation and the trust and the 22 scholarship letters going to 22 households in the mountains. All of those were true and all of them mattered. But the path worn in the grass by the weight of a man returning to the same place the same way across 40 years was the truest image she had of what Harold Calloway had been and what he had done with the time he was given. He had kept returning. That was the whole of it. She sat across from her son at the kitchen table in the house where Harold had pressed his hands against a desk for 30 years and drunk his coffee standing at the window and filled the bird feeder every Sunday morning without ever once thinking it required mentioning. She sat with her tea going cool in the cup and the folder with Gerald's name on it sitting beside the coffee and the ordinary late afternoon light going long in gold across the floor. And she thought about how the room in the Kentucky hillside was waiting in the dark right now with the climate control holding its numbers and the work lights off and the cases on the shelving and the paintings on the far wall and the bars of gold bullion in their careful rows, all of it waiting in the dark for the next time she opened the door and turned the lights on and came inside. She would go back in June. She had already decided this. She would go alone the first time again, the way she had gone alone the first time, because there were things you needed to do alone before you could share the doing of them. She would walk Harold's path through the green June grass, the path worn by his feet that the ground had kept, and she would work the combination and push open the heavy door and step into the cool, dry air that smelled of linseed oil and cedar and the particular smell of a space where a careful man had worked with his hands many times over many years. She would sit on the milk crate Harold had left by the tool bucket. She would sit in the room he had built for her across 40 years, and she would be in it, the way Harold had been in it in those late years when the building was done and the moment had not yet arrived. She would sit in the finished room and let it be finished around her. There was still work to do. There would always be work to do with something this large. The foundation was only in its first year. 3 of the scholarship recipients had already written letters to the foundation address that Earl Combs had given to the school district. Letters that Dorothy had read once, and then read again, and then set in the desk drawer beside the notebook because they belonged there, beside the words Harold had written and the words Gerald had read on the floor of a Kentucky bunker with his eyes wet. She did this every morning now, not with grief, or not only with grief, with something that felt more like company, the sense of a presence rearranged rather than absent. Harold redistributed into the weight of the desk, and the smell of the workshop and the path in the grass and the notebook in the drawer and the small particular sound of seed in a tray and a screen door closing gently on a spring morning. She thought this was what he had intended by all of it. Not the money, or not only the money. The presence. The sense that the person who had thought most carefully about how she would live without him had arranged for his thinking to go on being present after the thinking had stopped. He had arranged to stay. She thought he had managed it. The Cardinal came in 11 minutes every morning now, reliable as a thing that was built to be. She was beginning to understand that a great many things were like that, if the right person had done the building. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.